Designing for Resilience. I'm Audrey Sato, your AWA+D president. For anyone unfamiliar with us, AWA+D is an almost 100-year-old nonprofit professional organization committed to the career advancement of women in architecture and the allied fields. I'm so proud to be part of this continuing legacy and to work with you toward further change. Our tagline for the symposium, "The only constant in life is change," seems ever more relevant in these trying times. Our first two sessions featured Barbara Flameng, Taryn Bone, Carissa Schrock-Oyedel, and Sarah Abed, and focused on personal stories of toughness and grit, of women navigating tough situations and finding clarity of purpose. In our third session last week, we heard from Kien Ge and Elisa Orduna, who spoke about social justice issues related to climate change and homelessness, reminding us that income doesn't make you more or less human. If you missed it, we'll be putting those sessions up on our YouTube channel soon, so stay tuned. And we're also recording tonight's session in speaker mode, and we'll make that available as well. And at the end of tonight's session, we have an exciting drawing for a $50 gift card to Sky's Gourmet Tacos, a local minority women-owned restaurant. And for those of you who attended 4 or more sessions, we will raffle a gorgeous necklace by Fold, a jewelry company founded by local architect and AWA+D board member, Terry Moore. We have 2 more sessions left, so if you only attended 2 so far, you still have a chance to be entered to win. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the people who make this symposium possible. Our planning committee, Meg Coffey, Sarah Garina, Alejandra Ramirez, Marisa Kurtzman, Pamela Leone, and Stephanie Reich. Also, thank you to our annual sponsors, Louis Polson, Atomic Irrigation, Shimahara Visual, and Trajan Photography. Stephanie will now introduce our esteemed speaker.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I'm so pleased and proud to present Marissa Aho, AICP, who serves as Houston's Chief Resilience Officer since February 2019, where she and her team has released Resilient Houston in February of this year, a record 12 months. Her work has helped the city during COVID-19 pandemic. She has previously served as Los Angeles's first Chief Resilience Officer, where she led citywide resilience efforts, including those found in the Mayor's Resilience by Design report and Resilience Los Angeles strategy, released in March 2018 as part of the 100 Resilient Cities pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. Prior, she was an urban planning and land use professional for over 10 years and has become an important figure in LA and California planning community, serving in the leadership of APA and AICP. She has also developed and taught a graduate urban planning studio on resilience at USC Price School of Public Policy. Thank you for joining us, Marissa.
Thank you, Stephanie. I am so glad to be joining you guys this evening, and look forward to trying to talk about resilience during our current resilience challenging time. And we'll do my best to sort of keep things informal, as I have a tendency to do. But I put together a little bit of a presentation. I'm going to try and keep it short because I really think that it's most important to have time to discuss these things, and it will be a little high level, so feel free to ask some more detailed questions. But it was interesting, I saw this question posed as part of this conversation tonight, of where do we go from here? And I promise you, I do not have the answers. I talked to a former Chief Resilience Officer earlier today and said, what do you think of this question? You know, there's so much uncertainty right now. Things are urgent. We're in crisis mode all the time. Things are constantly changing, and that's kind of the whole point of resilience. So I've been a Chief Resilience Officer for over 5 years. I just celebrated that milestone, and it was a really significant one to me. Not many people make it 5 years. Similarly, I have had the honor of serving 2 fantastic mayors, Mayor Garcetti, who gave me a shot at this when we didn't know what this was, and then Mayor Turner, who was very persuasive in getting me to pick up my entire life and move to a new place. I spent a total of 72 hours in, and take on another challenge. And because, I mean, yeah, because you all are women or allies, I don't say this very often, but I'm not the first woman to do 2 resilience strategies for 6.3 million people. I'm the only person globally to have done 2 resilience strategies for the 2nd and 4th largest cities in the US. And so there are a lot of stories there, and I'm going to tell you a few of them. And I think when we think about where do we go from here, you know, I've been really looking at where have we been, and like starting with fundamentals. And I think a lot of CROs are looking at sort of re-looking at the fundamentals of resilience as we try to apply them to COVID-19 and everything else that's going on. And so I'll talk a little bit about the fundamentals, a little bit about my time in LA, and a little bit about what we're doing in Houston, including COVID-19, and then we'll still have time for questions. So I can't be a Chief Resilience Officer without first talking about how I define resilience. It's one of the worst sort of things to get across. And there are lots of ways to define it, but the way that we look at it is it's the capacity for an entity, whether that be an individual or a community or a business or a system or a city, to survive, adapt, and thrive, no matter what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. And I think we're experiencing how the acute shocks and the chronic stresses relate to each other. And that's always been my sort of favorite part of looking at resilience, is the intersection. And we know that our most vulnerable people, places, and systems are disproportionately affected when there is a disruption or a shock. And so really looking at solutions that address the shocks while they also make sure that we're addressing the stresses. And then there are a whole lot of other ways that you can describe resilience as well. I think I'm a stickler for, if you're talking about a certain part of resilience, be really specific so that people know what you mean, because not everybody sort of can, you know, understand your perspective of resilience. The other way that we're looking at resilience right now is this fancy little chart, but when there are disruptions or downturns, this idea that we can evolve and transform and take advantage of a crisis. And it's really interesting. We've been talking about bouncing forward and building back better for years. And I saw a political ad from a very predominant Democratic soon-to-be nominee about building back better this week. I was like amazed that the language that we've been using has finally sort of made it to that level and that platform. But we're always looking to try and get on that red line as best we can and as quickly as we can. And when I say we, sometimes I refer to the Global Resilient Cities Network, formerly 100 Resilient Cities. There was a transition last year. And now the Global Resilient Cities Network is full of, you know, approximately 100, sort of 80, 84-ish chief resilience officers in cities around the world. 79 resilience strategies have been launched. Houston was 79th. The 80th one is almost on its way, I hope. And now the Global Resilient Cities Network is co-led by cities. And so I have the honor of representing Houston and Mayor Turner by sitting on the steering committee for GRCN as one of 2 North America representatives. And so that means a whole lot of 7 a.m. calls, but it's worth it to keep this sort of movement going and make sure that it's city-led and it's led by the CROs who are doing the work in each of these really unique cities. And it's an opportunity for us to learn and grow together. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing around COVID at the end. This too is sort of one of those fundamentals that I've been looking at a lot lately. There's this framework that we use to create resilient strategies, lovingly referred to as the wheel. But a lot of CROs are looking at the wheel when it comes to our responses to COVID and trying to look at, I cut some of it off, but there's a basic needs section, there's a support livelihoods and environment section, and the whole approach to resilience is really trying to solve for more than one thing, given all of the stresses and shocks that are happening and all of the urgency around what we're trying to solve for. We don't have enough resources. And so sometimes we talk about de-siloing, but it's really looking at a holistic approach. And sometimes, not always, the wheel is a really good way of assessing if something is being holistic or if there's a way to pull another portion of the wheel into the solution or into the discussion. Here is a collage. And so it's very hard for me to talk about nearly 4 years serving as the Chief Resilience Officer in LA. I didn't know what resilience was. I was not an earthquake expert when I started the position. I was asked why I wanted the job. I said I didn't, but that I thought I could do a good job and that I like to run towards challenges, which is all true and all still very relevant to this position. I'm so proud of the work that was accomplished while I was there, and also all of the work that continues. I got a call a few weeks ago from folks in LA saying, you put public health emergencies in the strategy. And I said, well, of course I did. But this was a process where in LA, let's see. So we figured out that about 42% of Angelenos weren't around LA in the early 90s. So it was always a challenge to talk about resilience when, if you weren't there in the early 90s, when Northridge and the uprising or riots and other things were going on, you didn't take preparedness as seriously sometimes. And I actually stayed in the position and didn't announce I was leaving until right after the 25th anniversary of Northridge, because that was a really important moment. And so much of the work, particularly around seismic resilience in Los Angeles, was lessons learned during Northridge that were being implemented 20, 25 years later. And I really think that one of the differences between LA and Houston prior to this year, or 2 years ago, or there's been a few things going on in LA. I'm not trying to pretend that there hasn't, but is really the lack of constant shocks. And LA had its fair share of stresses, but there wasn't that catalytic moment. And so the work that we were doing was really, pushing a boulder up a hill, trying to show that this was really important and needed everybody at the table. At the same time, a lot was going on to build resilience globally. And I just wanted to highlight that we were working on global migration and resilience in 2016, and working on the intersection between racial equity and resilience at the end of 2018. And so there was a lot of resources that we developed over the last 5 years that really apply to this moment, and I'm very proud of that. So why in the world did I come to Houston? Houston was not where I thought I'd be right now, but Hurricane Harvey happened, and there were actually 6 federally declared flooding disasters in 5 years in Houston, including Harvey, but so many others. And I know I was teaching, I just started teaching the course at USC when Harvey happened. And it really affected the way that I taught my first sort of course as a new, very new teacher, and also just affected the way that I was looking at resilience. If you can remember 2017, there were these shocks that were happening globally and locally on a weekly basis. And so it really affected me. And it obviously affected Houston and everybody who is here. And Houston became a part of 100 Resilient Cities. We call it City 101 at the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Harvey. And through a $1.8 million support from actually Shell, Houston started its resilience program. And so a few months later, I got a bunch of texts all in one day saying, would you consider this? And the rest, I suppose, is history. The process for the last, I don't know, since then, it used to be 18 months, I think it's like 22 months now, was an entire rapid planning process that we did in LA in 2.5 years. We did it in Houston in a year, and really was able to learn from all of the work that was done in LA. And the way that I look at resilience, and Michael Berkowitz, who used to be the head of 100 Resilient Cities, said this quote actually at the LA release, but it's now is not the end, now is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And that's where we are in the Houston strategy. It was launched in February. 29 days later, the mayor declared the COVID disaster. And we have been adjusting and adapting and being resilient ever since. But the way that we based all of the resilience work is on what we were already doing here. And so there are, and this is the same approach that we took in LA. And that was, you know, people may not call what they're doing resilience, but it is resilience building. And the opportunity that the sort of resilience framework has is to stitch it all together and look for co-benefits and make it de-silo conversations, stack programs so that they have maximum outcomes. And the first sort of way that you start that process is by looking at what you're already doing and then identifying gaps and then making a plan to address them. And one of the other ways that we look at sort of comprehensive resilience is by identifying priority shocks and stresses. And so I wanted to talk about this tonight because this morning I started to think about what we were working on today because of COVID, because of the economic downturn, because of the oil and gas downturn, particularly in Houston. The price of gas went negative, and that barely got noticed because COVID was happening. And so I started to go down the list, like inequity, we're working on that every day, disparities in health, clearly, education access, exacerbated by COVID, economic inequality, exacerbated by COVID, environmental justice, exacerbated by COVID, food access, exacerbated by COVID, linguistic isolation. You get my point, exacerbated by COVID. And then you go to the next column, economic crisis, exacerbated. There are like 6 things on here that aren't top of mind right now. And I'm grateful that I'm not worrying about extreme cold, but that could change at any moment. We are worried about extreme heat and how that's exacerbated by COVID. So the strategy came out, and the vision that we set for Houston was to be a healthy place to live, an equitable, inclusive, and affordable city, a leader in climate adaptation, a city that grows up and not out, another tie to Los Angeles, and a transformative economy that builds forward. And the strategy has 5 chapters, 18 goals and targets, and 62 actions. And I still refuse to count the sub-actions, but folks tell me they're in the like 200 plus range. And I think a really important thing to talk about in terms of Houston and its resilience story is that there was really a tipping point at Harvey around climate change. And, 5 years ago, nobody talked about climate change here. And maybe even 3 years ago, nobody talked about climate change. But now that Houston is experiencing climate change on a pretty, annual basis, in terms of the disastrous flooding events, and in terms of the extreme heat that we are dealing with and will only get worse. The city also launched a climate action plan on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day this year. And so we have a new resilience strategy, a new climate action plan. We're constantly talking about both mitigation and adaptation and how important it is to tie those 2 parts of climate resilience and really have the momentum to move forward. The major entities in Houston are talking about leading the energy transition. And that is a fabulous thing to be a part of when those conversations weren't happening as much a number of years ago. So the other part of the strategy that I wanted to just talk about, because it's something that we developed in LA and I think made better in Houston. And that is that both of these strategies, out of the 79 that have been created globally, these are the only 2 that talk about resilience and are organized by scale. And when I think about resilience, maybe it's urban planning, maybe it's my particular background, or maybe it's that I like to organize things in a particular way. But I don't think that resilience can really happen until each of these scales are functioning in a resilient way. And I think the more that we can talk about people being resilient and neighborhoods being resilient, that's the only way we're going to get to a city that is resilient. And so with the individuals, really focusing on vulnerable populations, but just families, individual buildings, individual homes, individual yards, small businesses, and the folks who really, don't necessarily know what to do to help with the overall resilience picture, but there's so much that they can do as individuals, and trying to really bring that to the forefront of the conversation. And then neighborhood resilience, really in a place like Houston or LA or other large areas, the resilience challenges for one neighborhood are not the same as the resilience challenges for a neighboring neighborhood, or 1 mile away, or 10 miles away, or an hour and a half away. And so really trying to have that conversation with neighborhoods about what their challenges are. They may be flooding, it may be air quality, it may be human trafficking, it may be crime and violence. But the priorities are always going to be different, and the solutions are always going to be different. And so that's the approach that we're trying to take. there. And then the third chapter is on bayou resilience, or resilience. And there are 22 bayous and corresponding watersheds in Houston. And in an early draft of the LA strategy, we actually had a separate section on the LA River resilience, and it got folded in, and everything is still there. But it really is interesting to see how 22 mini rivers and one river have the same challenges, similar approaches, and ways that each city can learn from each other. But it's really about opening the sort of front door to the water asset and making sure that it's safe and clean. And in Houston, there are a lot of households that happen to live in the floodway. And so one of the major goals of this strategy is to remove habitable structures from the floodway. And I'm very proud of that, and that probably got the most press when we announced it. Finally, the last two chapters are about city resilience, and that's really how can a city function more resiliently? How can it lead by example on equity and climate change? How can we use data and metrics to make better decisions? How can we increase transparency? How can we increase equitable engagement and things like that, so that we are always trying to lead by example, even when it's really challenging. And then finally, in a region, so LA and Houston are surrounded by these massive regions, and the shocks and stresses that we're concerned about, we're experiencing this right now. They don't know those boundaries. And individuals may not know where exactly they live in the city, in the county, in a different city. And so to the extent possible, trying to look at resilient solutions in a regional way, in a coordinated way, and in a way that recognizes that for the average person, government is government, and these solutions just need to be addressed. So finally, once we released the strategy, it was very comprehensive. We had thought about it for 18 months. We had had thousands of people contribute. And then everything sort of changed instantly. And I automatically thought, well, the challenges that we had in February are still the challenges that we have now, but they've been exacerbated, they've changed possibly, they've been highlighted, maybe people notice them more now. And so how can we make sure, having just created a plan, that suddenly there's not a new plan? And so we quickly got to work at looking at the strategy we had just developed. I hadn't even pressed print. Like the print order, we'd done an order of 100 for the release. We were gonna spell check it, make sure we caught every single typo. We were working really hard to do that. And I held the print order so that we could do this COVID addendum. And so we looked at all 62 actions and identified 42 of them that applied to our current COVID recovery or response or adaptation, and quickly showed this, X strategy is important because of this aspect of COVID, or this aspect of job loss, or whatever aspect, so that we could translate the whole strategy into 3 pages of a cheat sheet of how it sort of applied to what we were going through now. And then we released that addendum and re-released the strategy, the one that's online right now, and got my 800 copies that are now sitting in boxes in my office because I can't give them to anyone. But we are using that as a framework for the way that we approach COVID-19 recovery and response. The mayor is having me and a number of other directors lead a health equity response task force as part of our COVID-19 response. We named it Health Equity Response. The acronym is HER. There are 5 female directors leading this program. We get a kick out of that every once in a while. And then on the global scale, the Global Resilient Cities Network launched Cities for Resilient Recovery. There have been weekly conversations about various aspects of resilience related to COVID-19, whether that be the intersection with urban heat, whether that be the intersection with food. Those are a few of my favorites, I think, for the last 18 weeks. And so these are available to anyone. And unlike the 100 Resilient Cities program or GRCN sort of main program where cities have to apply and be chosen and there are rules and it's sort of exclusive, Cities for Resilient Recovery is open to anybody. And I think as a member of the steering committee, I'm very proud of that, because in a crisis, these conversations should be open to anyone. So there's much more that I could say, but I'm going to leave it there to start our discussion and hope that that gave you a bit of a frame of what's going on.
Thank you so much. There's been a lot of questions flooding in through the chat, and I kind of wanted to start the conversation tagging on to a question from Meg Coffey. You were talking about how with resilience, priorities and solutions are going to always be different depending on the individual or the neighborhood. And it seems like it would be very easy to let politics sort of water down what the best, most logical, sensible approach might be. And so I think Meg's question about how the strategies that you come up with are actually implemented, whether they're voted on by city council or become part of a budget, like if you can talk more about the way that plans are implemented, I think that'd be really interesting.
Sure. So both strategies were adopted via executive order, and there was not a council process. However, part of the executive order directed departments to implement the strategies. And in both cities, you can tell I'm just repeating things. In both cities, we also established the Departmental Resilience Officers program. And so in Houston, every single department has a departmental resilience officer. Our public works department has 3. And so I now convene those folks regularly, and I'm working with them to implement the work that was identified in the strategy and embed resilience as a practice into everything that we do. And so the way that I approach implementation of the strategies are in a few ways. One, I'm very opportunistic, which isn't a word that you usually use in government, but because it's really not about doing something new, it's about embedding this approach into what we're already doing. And so there are always opportunities to just stick a little something in that gets us the outcomes that we're looking for. And so I'll give one example that I love. And that is that through the Harvey Recovery Program, we have funding to support multifamily affordable housing developments. And so there was RF something that was released in January. And so we worked with our housing department. I sort of said, like, any opportunity where there is federal, state, or local money that we're touching and then giving to somebody is an opportunity for us to embed what we want to see. And so what we did is notice of funding. There we go. So what we did is put together a resilience matrix into the notice, where we asked each developer who's proposing an affordable housing development to get funding. through the program to do a number of things under certain categories. And so we asked them to get a minimum of 12 points, and there were points about like wet proofing or adding community elements or putting together safety plans. We also included LEED. We included solar or solar ready, EV charging or EV ready. We included green infrastructure. We included a whole host of the things that we were trying to accomplish. And then all of the projects that were submitted got at least 12 points, like we had asked them to. Many did much more, and that was used as part of the evaluation. And there are 16 projects that are now moving forward that have these elements because we asked for them. And also we now have data of what the development community is in Houston is most interested in putting into their projects so that we can encourage the things that worked and maybe lay off the things that didn't, and continue to work with the market and work with our partners to increase all of the outcomes that we're looking for. But that was one way. And so we're really tying the resilience work to the recovery work. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to do in coming to Houston, was being able to tie recovery and resilience. And that's something that every community is gonna have to do moving forward with recovery of everything that we're recovering from.
Makes sense. Thank you. I think we should open up to the audience for questions. Sarah, you can monitor the chat, and if anyone wants to raise their hand or you can unmute and ask your question verbally as well.
Okay, great. So we went over Meg's question. Alicia asks, UC Berkeley is at risk for earthquakes. It became clear that we needed to go beyond life safety to maintaining operations if the university itself was going to survive an event. A relatively low additional investment in the structural system of my projects, in theory, would ensure that a very worthwhile investment. I have not read resilient plans. Is there communication about the value of such investments with the construction community? And what is the background of resilience officers? How does one become one?
Sure, those are great questions. Yeah. We did talk about immediate occupancy, or whatever you want to call a non-life safety code in the LA strategy as one of the actions. And yeah, we're part of. I'm still serve as an advisor to the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, and so I still get to have some of my seismic conversations. That is a really important conversation, both at local and sort of state levels. And Keith Porter's work on sort of what the difference is between life safety codes and immediate occupancy, or whatever you want to call them. There are different names. Codes are, that percentage, especially for new buildings and not retrofits, is really small, and his work seems to be very progressive about it. We also, I think I'm allowed to talk about this, just finished a report to Congress that covers some of this in terms of sort of federal education around these issues. And so hopefully there will be some progress in the next few years to really embrace this issue. In terms of CROs, so it's interesting, chief resilience officers have very different backgrounds. Some come from sort of the health world, some come from the community organizing world, some come from the emergency management world. Some are urban planners. El Paso's is a an architect. So it's really people who are problem solvers, are okay with swimming the other direction sometimes of the status quo. And there are more and more resilience officers, even though the 100 RCs program is no longer funding resilience officers. GRCN, the Global Resilient Cities Network, announced in February that we were adding 10 cities to the program, and so that's sort of ongoing. But I mean, Santa Monica has a great chief resilience officer. The county of San Diego has a great chief resilience officer. The state of Florida had a chief resilience officer, and they got swept up by the federal government. And so these roles are not only occurring more and more at the sort of government, city, state level, but are also really occurring at the private sector level too. And so I think it's an exciting time. When I started, I didn't know what you did after you were a chief resilience officer, and I guess I still didn't know, so I became a chief resilience officer again.
That's great. I'm skipping to a similar question, or one I think we could tie to. Marissa asks, why do you think women are such a particularly notable presence in the conversation about resilience? Do you think that women have a perspective to offer that is particularly forward-thinking?
That's a really great question, because at the beginning of at least the Chief Resilience Officer program, there were not a lot of women at all. And when I joined, there were still not a lot of women. Good question. So I'm just gonna, perhaps women have a little more determination. So my family is Finnish, and Finland has this motto called sisu, and sisu basically translates to either stubbornness, according to my uncle, or resilience. But there is that ability to persevere that is definitely required when talking about resilience and when trying to be a change agent, which is really what resilience is all about.
That's great. Okay, also for Marissa, this is such an interesting presentation, thank you. In your opinion, what are LA's priority shocks and stresses? Where would you even start?
LA?
Yeah.
I wrote that book.
Yeah.
LA came to resilience through seismic. You know, the first year I was there, actually the first few years I was there, when I would talk about resilience holistically, you know, the response that I got was, oh, you mean earthquakes? It's like, nope, there's more than that. I'm really proud of the work that LA has done and continues to do related to seismic work. I did work with Elisa at Mayor Garcetti's office. We were tight when it comes to integrating all of the homeless work that is so important into resilience. And I would say that is another challenge in both cities. Climate change is a huge resilience challenge, and one where the differences between LA and Houston are really daily interesting to me. Climate change, homelessness. Oh, I mean, housing affordability and mobility is also a huge challenge for both cities. In Houston, you know, it's thought of as an affordable place, but when you add transportation costs, it's no longer affordable. And I think there are lessons learned or lessons being learned in Los Angeles that I hope to talk about a lot, or I do talk about a lot in Houston, to try to accelerate the way that we respond here because of the challenges that housing affordability has in LA.
Thank you. Stephanie asks, has the framework, including the process, outreach, relationships, built naturally, become a blueprint for how the mayor and city organization respond to COVID? Can you talk a little bit about how the process of making the plan has allowed the city organization to adapt?
Yeah, so the best example of this, I think, is that we focused a lot on equity in the strategy in Houston. And it was a little controversial at the beginning. An elected official made a request for a list of the folks that were in my equity and inclusion working group, which I sent them a list of everyone who was in every part of my working group, not just that one, all of them. And so that conversation has been an interesting one, where you still have to explain the difference between equity and equality on a regular basis. When COVID-19 began, at the very beginning, we established a COVID-19 task force and response committees and PPE and seems like a long time ago, HR and communications, public relations, and sort of sheltering and whatever. And about 6 days in, something just didn't feel right to me. And so I wrote our Office of Emergency Management and asked that there be an at-risk and vulnerable populations working group started as a part of our immediate response. And I gotta love the South, because the response I got was, yes, ma'am. And so 3 days later, I started leading the at-risk and vulnerable populations working group. So March 16th. And that is a conversation that we have with city departments on a weekly basis. And we've been able to focus on food access, on mobility access, on technology access, and then just generally on coordinating all of our internal and external efforts, so that our eye has always been on at-risk and vulnerable populations and whatever stage we are in the process, and what are the issues and what are the challenges and how can we address them quickly. And I don't think that that would have happened without this process and without this role.
Oh, okay, so we have another question from Meg. How do you account for human opinion in strategizing for resilience? You can lead a horse to water, ... You may have touched on this a little bit. I'd like to hear some more.
Well, so there are differences of opinion. We have a lot of community members and elected officials who may not see eye to eye on every part of resilience. Perhaps climate is not their jam, but economic resilience is. And so part of my role is everybody doesn't have to focus on everything. We don't have enough time. Like, how can we tie people's interests and what they're already doing to this larger strategy? And so I regularly challenge anyone to think about how they're contributing to our resilience work. And if they can't figure out a connection, well, I sure can, because I can tie almost everything to the work that we're trying to do. And if someone is interested in jobs, great. If somebody's interested in creating markets around paying for things and innovative finance, great. If someone wants more data and metrics, great. Like, there's so much work to do in this space, so it really is about being able to just say, well, what are you interested in? Okay, great. Like, let's figure out your role in resilience.
That makes sense. So another question from Marisa: how's it going trying to implement these strategies during COVID? Is there a timeline, or did that get blown out of the water because of the virus?
Great question. So more than half of my time is now spent on COVID. And I am still in office of one. We did get some interns, both virtually and live. We are moving everything forward the best we can. I would say that I'm used to A+ work, and now I'm doing A- work because of the challenge in just trying to move everything forward and wear 6 hats. But we, the mayor has been very clear with me. We even, a few months into COVID, had a little "what are my priorities" chat that sometimes you have with your bosses. We had a "what are my priorities" chat because I was feeling pulled in every direction. Still am. And my priorities are implementing the resilience strategy. So, and also COVID. So, I can't think of something that is behind, except for my ability to do exceptional project management. And that is the thing where if I had an extra hour in the day, like, there would be more Excel spreadsheets filled out with like color coded and like being presentable. And that is the part of this that I'm letting fall away for the time being.
Okay. From Stephanie: it sounds like the policies you're discussing are very progressive for what we think of as typical for Houston. How did you go about getting people within the city and with your stakeholders to embrace these ideas moving forward?
Yeah. So turns out the perception about Houston is not typically accurate. So it's an incredibly diverse city. I think both LA and Houston say they're the most diverse city, so I'm not picking in that race. And Mayor Turner is an exceptionally progressive leader in a very red state. And some of this is new, but there is a whole host of partners and advocates and community members who are really supportive of this work. There are so many community organizations. I refer to them as the coalition of coalitions because they're just so many. And so I think there's a lot of support and a lot of folks who have been doing this work and for you know, for decades. There's an environmental justice group that I'm really excited to do more with, and they've been around talking about environmental justice in Houston for 25 years. And so those folks are my partners, and I have the honor of just learning from them and then being in a position of working in the mayor's office to try to advance what they are working on and try to connect it to what our sort of priorities and objectives are. So it really is, and folks are really nice. And yeah, it's not what I expected, honestly.
Yeah. Alejandra asks, do you have the opportunity to speak with different agencies within the city, for example, the police department, to respond to various movements such as Black Lives Matter? What are the differences between social strife and climate or virus related issues? Yeah.
So yes, the police department, both, but Houston's police department has a chief resilience officer. So that's really exciting and an opportunity. And we are talking about these issues as you can imagine. So one of the things that Mayor Turner did in Houston is he created this Complete Communities program in 2017, prior to Harvey. And he grew up in one of the communities in Houston that is historically underinvested in. And so he identified in 2017 5 complete communities who were historically disinvested in or underinvested in. And there's been a planning process in a place that doesn't really do as much neighborhood planning as other places. And that was community led. It had leadership groups in each community that really worked with the planning department and other consultants to like lead that work. And then in 2019, there were 5 more communities that were added. And so those plans are being finalized now. And so these 10 communities out of 88 sort of super neighborhoods are part of the Complete Communities Initiative. And so the overlap of these communities in terms of underinvestment, in terms of climate issues, in terms of health disparities. There's a 24-year difference in life expectancy in Houston, depending on what neighborhood you live in. 24 years, that's a generation. These are the same communities that are suffering the worst because of COVID. We identified 22 of these communities as part of the Health Equity Response Task Force, but there's a lot of overlap with the Complete Communities. And so the Complete Communities program sort of helps the city to prioritize resources being allocated in these areas, trying to coordinate implementation in these areas, and trying to address the sort of holistic disparities in these areas. And so I think it's we're still got a long way to go. You got centuries of disparities to try and address, but I think the approach and recognizing that whether you're talking about whatever resilience challenge you're talking about, being able to recognize that if environmental justice is an issue in this community, then so is COVID, then so is whatever else.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think there's just one more question. I'm taking the next one from Natalie Hernandez. She says, can you talk about resilience hubs? Are any starting in Houston Climate Resolve is working with USDN on efforts to spur them in Southern California.
Yes, and hi, Natalie. We did put resilience hubs into the Houston strategy, like the LA strategy. But in Houston, they had a name before I arrived that I kind of love. And so they're called, the concept of a neighborhood resilience hub, for anyone who is not aware, is this idea that there should be a trusted place in the community on a blue sky day that functions as a way to have the community build resilience, that also functions as that place that community members trust to go in an emergency. And depending on the sort of shocks and stresses that that community faces, that hub could be a seismically safe place with places to charge cell phones or leave messages or food distribution. Or in Houston, it could have a boat so that people could rescue other people who are stranded because of flooding. So in Houston, the Neighborhood Resilience Hub nickname is a lily pad, because the major issue is that they can't flood in order to serve this purpose and to be that place that folks can go in an emergency, and most likely in a flooding emergency. So we are moving those forward. We're looking at a pilot, looking at trying to see sort of the same conversation that we had in LA, the what is necessary and what is nice to have, and how does that process go. And then the biggest issue, I think, globally with neighborhood resilience hubs is, how do you sustain them? And so there were centers after Harvey here that were created, and the idea was to have them sustain, but the funding, frankly, wasn't there to sustain them. And so how can you stack enough programs that run out of a resilience hub so that it is sustainable? But keep me posted on the hubs in LA. I know they're working on them.
Great. Okay,
Well,
yeah, Audrey.
Oh no, I was just gonna say thank you so much. It's 7:33, so I think we should wrap up at this point. It's been such an honor for you to join us, and we really appreciate all of the A+ work you're doing, regardless of COVID or not. I'm sure it's A+. And for the audience, before we do our drawing, I just want to remind everyone that next week we'll have a continuation of our symposium, and it will feature our sister organization, the Association for Women in Architecture Foundation. They're going to award their scholarships and host a roundtable on resilience and achievement from prominent past scholarship winners, including Ingela Walrus-Ritter, Karin Liljegren, and Erin Cuevas. So thanks, and stay tuned for next week. I'll turn it over to Sarah to do our drawing.
Yay. Okay, this week we're giving away a $50 gift card to Sky Tacos, a minority-owned taco shop in Los Angeles, minority woman-owned. And the winner this week is Alicia Rosenthal. I think you're still on. You still here? Yay, she's still here. She's muted. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, everyone. As Audrey said, there's a final award or a drawing at the end of this series for a beautiful necklace you may have seen. All right, so I want to just give our speaker a round of applause. That was amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.